Welcome back, everyone. So, there I was one day just mindlessly scrolling through TikTok videos, and I came across a pretty interesting one involving Spider Man and Tony Stark. And it supposes that Tony Stark is either partially or fully responsible for Peter Parker gaining his abilities. I want to explore this and maybe even expound upon it. Also, if you like my stuff, please give me a like and sub. So, let us explore this idea. As we all know, Peter Parker was a mild-mannered, brilliant, but lazy high school student. Peter has a knack for science and was prone to developing gadgets. Peter Parker was raised by his Uncle Ben and Aunt May since his parents had died in a plane crash. Peter's origin story is as follows. One day, at a science exhibit, now this exhibit may or may not have ties to Oscorp, depending on which variation of the Spider-Man story you choose to read or watch, Peter gets bitten by a radioactive spider. After a little recovery time and some time quarantining, Peter gains the agility and proportionate strength of an arachnid, specifically a spider. Peter could also stick to surfaces and displayed peak athletic abilities. Just a quick aside, in the 2002 Spider-Man, the one that Sam Raimi directed, Peter also wakes up with an instant six-pack. Peter's science background also comes into play when he invents a system of cuff-worn wristbands that were capable of shooting artificial webbing, so basically his web shooters. What also creates the character as Spider-Man, which is probably even more important than his powers, is his moral compass and his immense feeling of responsibility. You see, these qualities come with a severe price for Peter, and this is due to his father figure, Uncle Ben, dying. Now, the exact series of events differ slightly from the various comics or movie origins. Basically, what it boils down to is Peter having the chance to apprehend a petty criminal, but he doesn't do it. The same criminal ends up accidentally killing his Uncle Ben. Obviously, Peter blames himself for his uncle's death and takes a bit of wisdom that his father figure had told him to his very soul. And of course, that is, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. This single act transforms Peter Parker from the brilliant, nerdy kid into the superhero we all know and love. What makes Earth 199999, basically the MCU, different is we don't know Peter Parker's exact origin story. We know he was at the Stark Expo in 2010 as a young boy. He was the kid in the Iron Man mask. We also know he was an orphan, raised by his Aunt May. And he has quite a steady following on YouTube. And no, I'm not jealous of that. Not at all. Why would I be jealous of a fictional character named Peter Parker? Why? In 2016's Captain America Civil War, we know that Tony Stark recruits Peter for his varsity team to beat Cap and his gang of ruffians. So what does this tell us? That Tony knew of Spider-Man's true identity. Now, this isn't something that is groundbreaking since Tony is one of the richest and most resourceful men on Earth 199999. But why would Peter Parker be on Tony's radar? It is because Tony Stark is not only responsible for Peter's short-lived career of being an Avenger, but he is also responsible for Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man. Dun dun dun! Now, I know what you're thinking. Yes, Tony gave Peter both of his Spidey suits, and even the third was created with Stark Tech. Come to think of it, Peter has only managed to make one spider suit, and that was that sweat getup. I'm talking about Tony setting into motion the very event that gave Peter Parker his powers. This is where the theory starts to have merit. You see, in the much earlier Sony produced movies and the Ultimates comic run, Earth 1610, which is very much an inspiration of the early MCU, by the way, Spider-Man's origins involved Peter going to an Oscorp facility that housed radioactive spiders. Oscorp was, of course, founded by Norman Osborn, who we would eventually know as the Green Goblin. Now, given that Norman Osborn was a pretty unscrupulous guy, I mean, the guy turned himself into the Green Goblin, later in the comics, creates a dark version of the Avengers. It's pretty cool, actually. You gotta read it. Oscorp is definitely a reflection of Norman Osborn, and thus it is possible that a radioactive spider was able to get loose and introduce a biological agent into a miner. Man, someone call OSHA. In the Sam Raimi version, Oscorp Labs are depicted as a chemical division based in New York. This corporation has a division for military tech that produced a flight suit complete with a glider. A pretty badass weapons contractor for sure. Now, is it me, or does Oscorp and Stark Industries seem to have a lot in common? Now let's follow this path of thinking. So far, there is no Oscorp as we know it in the MCU, but there is a Stark Industry. They may have had a chemical division at one point, but what we do know for sure is they were one hell of a military contractor before Tony moved away from it. Also, there is no Oscorp Tower in New York, but there is a Stark Tower. I'm guessing you can see where I'm going. Pretty much Stark Industries might be the MCU equivalent to Oscorp, or at least for the purposes of this theory, they are. Now, I'm supposing that Oscorp's connection to Spider-Man's origins is at play, like in most of the movies and some of the comics. Tony Stark at some points can be considered an unscrupulous character himself, mostly pre-Iron Man when Obadiah Stane was running the day-to-day operations of Stark Industries. When Iron Man saw the horror of his creations in the hands of the people he was trying to protect innocent lives from, it changed his life and the direction of his company. We saw this evolution of Tony mostly in Iron Man 1, but in Iron Man 2, we again saw Tony try and keep his Iron Man tech out of the hands of people that would do harm with it, like Ivan Vanko and Justin Hammer. However, by the time of the first Avengers movie, something again had changed in Tony Stark. It began with the death of Agent Phil Coulson by the hands of Loki. And after seeing the sheer might of this alien force sent to destroy the Earth, and specifically New York, Tony nearly sacrificed himself to try and ensure that humanity had a future. And as a result, he suffered from some pretty extreme PTSD. By the time of 2015-ish, or Age of Ultron, Tony values the safety of humanity as being his primary mission. The rights and freedom of the citizens of the Earth were a far secondary goal. Early on in the movie, we see Tony had created the Iron Legion since the first Avenger movie. The Iron Legion was a group of Iron Man armors that acted with limited autonomy in order to guard and protect civilians when the Avengers were fighting in populated areas. As we can tell later in the movie, after seeing what lays in store for the planet, he develops a plan to wrap the Earth in a suit of armor, aka Ultron. Of course, we know how this plays out, but It really was good intentions that motivated Tony Stark, even if he didn't think everything through. So at this point, let us assume the origin of Spider-Man isn't random. Here's one scenario, and possibly the most viable of the theory. The radioactive spider was the property of Stark Industries because reasons. Tony was unaware of this, either completely or possibly he figured it out when he learned the identity of Spider-Man being Peter Parker. This is very plausible and it paints Tony in the best light. Tony either didn't know or found out after the fact. It also explains the feeling of responsibility Tony has with Peter. After all, it was his company that set a series of events in motion that changed Peter's life forever and gave birth to the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Here's a different scenario that paints Tony in a less favorable light. The events unfold like before, but Tony tracks down the recipient of the spider bite much sooner. Now, you may ask, would it be possible? And I would say, yeah, sure, why not? Stark had used Bruce Banner and his expertise in gamma radiation to track down the Tesseract in the first Avengers movie. So, would it be that hard for him to track down a radioactive signature from one of his spiders? From this point, after tracking Peter, he passively keeps tabs on the young would-be web-slinger. If there were adverse effects from the bite, he would probably have a medical team that he had put on the payroll, quietly, to help the young Peter Parker. But since the effects were not adverse, nor life-threatening, or better yet, it was actually beneficial, he keeps letting it play out, with Peter becoming like a proto-version of Spider-Man with the sweats and goggles combo. And when it comes time for Peter to become of use to Tony Stark, he recruits him to go up against Captain America and his gang of ruffians. The only thing really different between these two hypothetical situations is timing. With the first one, the effects of the spider bite have already passed, and there really was nothing that Tony could do aside from not telling Peter that he had inadvertently become a science experiment. This last variation is the one that paints Tony in the least flattering light. What if, and this is a big if, but what if Tony engineered the spider bite? Now I know this isn't very likely, but hear me out. We know that Tony met Peter Parker in 2010 at the Stark Expo. What if Tony had always kept tabs on that little boy? And what if he saw his interest in science and high-level intellect and thought, well, hell, I can make him a superhero. Peter had shown a lot of bravery when he was being faced by one of Vanko's killer drones. Tony and Peter share the experience of being orphans. I mean, really, truth be told, they have so much in common. Is it possible Tony saw potential in Peter Parker long before anyone else did? Again, this is very unlikely, but so is creating not one, but two super androids with Ultron and the Vision. Also, we know that Tony keeps tabs on young, brilliant kids. For example, the kid who helped Tony in Iron Man 3 was at his funeral, which leads me to believe that he kept in contact with him the whole time. And like I had said earlier, Tony cares less about individual rights if they conflict with the bigger picture. Case in point, the imprisonment of Wanda Maximoff in the Avengers compound. Now, I agree that's a big jump between temporarily detaining a superhero and actively creating a superhero from a minor without their consent, but it is kind of in the same ballpark. Tony deprived Wanda of her freedom. Is it possible Tony deprived Peter of choice? If this is the case, then it would seem to be that Tony engineered this particular spider just to bite Peter. Tony wouldn't have left it to chance, so he would know exactly what the transformation process would be. and if it would be fatal for young Peter Parker. If this is truly the case, we don't currently know because the MCU Sony version of Spider-Man lacks an origin story. But if this dark theory happened, it would have been around the time of Age of Ultron or immediately post Age of Ultron. This is when Tony Stark was kind of at his most dangerous with his ill-fated plans full of good intentions. Could the secret Project Human Spider have been one of them? We know Tony has the intellect to make this work. He also has the means with his vast resources. So Tony could have willingly created Spider-Man, but the question is, would he? Could this be just another layer to his suit of armor around the world strategy? Probably not. As morally ambiguous as Tony can be at times, I don't think he would be able to willingly create Spider-Man without the knowledge or consent of Peter Parker. This particular scenario might be the line he's unwilling to cross. But you cannot say it isn't a possibility. If nothing else, it does make the scenes between Tony and Peter hit a little bit differently if Tony is responsible for the creation of Spider-Man. If even one of the three options end up being true, then it means even though Tony Stark is not the father of Peter Parker, he could be considered the father of Spider-Man. I hope you've enjoyed my little speculation and theory video. It was fun to do. Also, if you enjoy my content, please give me a like and a sub. My neighbor tells me that it helps with the YouTube algorithm, but I definitely know it helps feed my ego. So until next time, my friends, fare thee well and take care. Cue the music.